So tonight, here we all are. Welcome. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Alex Woolf to give us our talk tonight. You must have sympathy for the poor man. I've been pursuing him for about 2 years to get him to talk to us, and I think he's come up with what sounds like a particularly fascinating subject tonight. I tried looking up Muawiya. I don't know how to pronounce him. I got as far as Wikipedia and I couldn't find any mention of a synod. So I think this is all going to be very interesting. I'm sure an awful lot of you are very familiar with Alex, but for those who are not, I'll read you some well-chosen words about him. I say well-chosen because he chose them. Alex was raised on the Sussex coast and educated at the University of Sheffield. After brief stints lecturing at the University of Wales, Lampeter, and the University of Edinburgh, he took up a post at St Andrews in 2001, where he has been teaching ever since. He has published on a range of early Insular and Scandinavian topics, but is best known, absolutely, for his work on Dark Age Scotland. So without further ado, I will hand over to him. If you could please post any questions as we go along in the chat facility, I will attempt to put them to him at the end, and we'll have a good Q&A, I hope. So thank you very much, Alex. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Alistair. Thanks for the invitation, and it's nice to be here. I only wish I really was there. It's a long time since I've been up to Rosemarkie, and I must come back up there again soon. Okay, I'm going to start sharing screen now, which hopefully will work. Might take a moment, these things off to do, but can people see it now?
Yes, I certainly can. Yep. Yes, good, thank you.
Okay, well, thanks very much. Well, what I'm going to be talking about tonight is sort of the convergence of two areas of interest that sort of somehow came together. One is my sort of long-term professional interest in Dark Age Scotland, and I've been teaching about Columba, Iona, and those kinds of things, for which we largely rely on the witness of Adomnán of Iona, 9th Abbot of Iona. For a long time, but the other interest is an interest in the earliest phases, the earliest generations of Islamic history, something I've heard is nowadays called Paleo-Islamic history, which I was very interested in when I was much younger, but because I never had the opportunity to study it formally or to learn the languages, I sort of set on a back burner. But now, as I'm heading towards my second childhood, I've begun to read a bit more about this. And what I'm going to do today is to bring these things together in a way that I think is generally quite interesting. I'm also going to make a slightly crazy suggestion, which I'd appreciate the responses from people there who are better qualified than me to tell me if it's completely mad. So here we go. Adomnán of Iona, Muawiya ibn Abi Sufyan, and a tale of two synods. So first, to introduce the main characters. Adomnán of Iona, as I've said, was the 9th Abbot of Iona, born in Donegal around about 624, and best known for being the author of the Vita Columba, the Life of Saint Columba. And indeed, almost everything we think we know about Saint Columba, we owe to Adomnán's pen. Not everything, but almost everything. He was also very well known in the early Middle Ages for producing Lex Innocentium or Innocentium, an edict that was proclaimed at a synod and royal council at Birr on the borders of Munster and Meath in 697, 100 years after the death of Columba, which claimed that Iona would have to get paid a fine for the killings of non-combatants, women, clerics, and other non-combatants. It's tended to be focused on women, and a story was introduced at some point that he'd done this to keep his mother happy, which is what the rather garish illustration there is showing. I just do a slight aside here about the problem with illustrating events and peoples from early medieval Scotland, certainly, but perhaps our era more generally, which is if you look for pictures of Adomnan, it's very hard to find things that are even vaguely contemporary or realistic. You'll get stained glass windows, things of that sort. And it seems to me we've got very good reconstruction artists doing archaeological sites and buildings and so on. It'd be quite nice to get some sort of fund together to commission some of these people to produce some event pictures so we don't keep falling back to 19th century paintings. Anyway, Adomnan, as I say, born in 624. We don't know much about the rest of his career. Presumably at some point he went to Iona, but he certainly became abbot there in 679 and was abbot for about 25 years until the early 8th century. So he's one of our main characters, probably well known to this audience. The other one, perhaps less well known, is Muawiya ibn Abi Sufyan. He was the 5th caliph of Islam, effectively taking over in 660. They're not inaugurated till 661 and dying in 680, so a year into Adomnan's time as abbot of Iona. He was born at some time between 607 and 614, so between 10 and 17 years older than Adomnan. And he was the second governor of Syria after the Islamic conquest of that region. He took over from his brother who died in the plague. Now, there's one of the problems with this phase of Islamic history that this sort of first generation or so after the death of the Prophet is that we have very few contemporary sources. The century between the mid-7th and the mid-8th century produced no extant histories in Byzantium, in the Eastern Roman Empire. I suspect they weren't very keen on recording their almost constant defeat in that period and their loss of territory. And we have no Byzantine histories that mention him that are contemporary or near contemporary. And the histories that come from the Islamic side are mostly products of the late 9th and early 10th century. Great historians like Al-Tabari and Al-Baraduri, who were working probably in Iraq around about 900. And so we have almost no contemporary references to him, but we do have a few inscriptions. I'm showing you one here on the slide, which is in Greek, and it's from Gadara, famous for the miracle of the Gadarene swine in the Gospels, where Jesus puts the demon who says his name is Legion into a herd of pigs. As a result of this, it became a center of pilgrimage, and a healing bath was put up there. And this was restored during Muawiya's reign. And you could see his name appears as Muawiya there in the Greek. And he's described as the commander of the faithful and so on. And there's also a couple of other inscriptions in Arabic. But the only contemporary literary text to refer to him was written by Adomnan of Iona. And that's what strikes me as quite interesting and curious, that the only contemporary of Muawiya's whose work survives, who wrote anything of any length about him that's more than a sentence or two in an inscription or in possibly a Syriac chronicle, we'll come to that later, is an abbot living on the far western edge of the world. So that's one of the things that interests me in the long run in terms of comparing the Paleo-Islamic world with Scotland and Ireland in this period. They're both areas that were on the very fringes of the Roman Empire, opposite fringes of the Roman Empire, that were really only brought into the world of civilization in this late antique period as the empire itself collapses. So peoples on the fringe come to share in its cultural world. Now, Muawiya has a very peculiar reputation in Islamic historiography. As I say, most of the historiography dates to the 9th or 10th century, and all of that then it was being written after the Abbasid revolution, when the dynasty that Muawiya founded, the Umayyads, were overthrown, and that happened between 750 and 751. And so there's a definite negative strand in the way that he's presented. But it's a strand that doesn't seem to be committed entirely to being negative. So that most of the writers, Arab historians write both positive and negative things about him, and often will give both opinions on a particular situation. So, for example, the two great writers, Baladari and Tabari, both say that it is said that Muawiya apostatized and became a Christian, but they don't believe it. But they both tell us that other people say that, though they don't tell us who. Another thing that was different about Muawiya, if we're to believe everything we're told about him, is that he was the first caliph of Islam not to rule from Medina in the Hejaz, so in modern-day Saudi Arabia. His predecessors, the first four caliphs and the Prophet Muhammad himself, of course, ruled from Medina and lived a relatively ascetic life in a relatively normal townhouse, which has been excavated and can be seen. Muawiya, however, had been governor of Syria from late 639, and he stayed in Damascus, his capital there, even after he became caliph. He also did something that was rather peculiar, if we're to believe the sources, or as I say, none of them are exactly contemporary, which is that when he was chosen by the Arab tribes to be the successor of Ali after a brief civil war, he went to Jerusalem and took the oath from all the Arab tribes, Christian and Muslim, while sitting enthroned on the hill of Golgotha, the place where the crucifixion happened and where, according to local Syriac Christian belief, Adam was buried. So he's a very peculiar character, and it's quite interesting that our only contemporary source is from Scotland. This source is De Locis Sanctis. This was written by Adomnan in or before 688, when he presented a copy to his former pupil, King Aldfrith of Northumbria. And this is, as I say, the earliest literary text to mention Muawiya, calling him Mavias, very similar to the form in the Greek that we saw. Now, in the introduction to the book, Adomnan says that it's based on an eyewitness account by a Gaulish bishop named Arculf, who's said to have gone on pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and the title, the Latin title, De Locis Sanctis, means on the holy places. Now, there's a couple of English translations available. The one by Macpherson you can actually get free on archive.org. The Meehan one, which is the more up-to-date one, is slightly more harder to lay your hands on. It includes illustrations, as you can see here. It actually has Golgotha on it here in the middle. So this is where Muawiya was enthroned. And it gives an account of the Holy Land, a little bit about Byzantium. A lot of it's about places where things happened, what the burial place of Abraham looks like, and so on, what Jericho looks like. And there's been much interest in this text, in why Adomnan wrote it, how he came to know about it, to know the material. As I say, he claims that he was taking down dictation from a Gaulish bishop named Arculf. There's no other evidence for this Arculf existing, although there must have been lots of bishops in Gaul whose names we don't know, as well as Gaulish bishops serving elsewhere in Ireland and so on, who we don't know about. So that's not a big surprise. Although the name Arculf doesn't look like a real name. This first element, Arc, doesn't look like a Germanic element from a dichromatic name. Again, not impossible, might be a slight scribal error. Perhaps he was called Asculf or something of that sort. But some people have been suspicious because of the name of Arculf and because we have no other evidence of him. Bede, who produced an abridged version of De Locis Sanctis and also briefly mentions it in the Historia Ecclesiastica, says that Arculf was shipwrecked on Iona on his way back to Gaul from the Holy Land, which seems a bit of a detour. Although Adomnan himself does not say that. He simply says that he took it down from Arculf, who had been to the Holy Land. It has been suggested that that the understanding that Iona lies between Gaul and the Holy Land is due to somebody, either Bede or Adomnan, having a sort of topological sense of a map, a bit like the London Tube map, that knowing that Gaul lies immediately south of Britain, that Iona lies between Britain and Ireland, that Ireland lies opposite Spain, which is what people in late antiquity believed, and that you get out of the Mediterranean through the Pillars of Hercules on the south side of Spain, would mean you'd obviously have to go past Iona to get from the Holy Land to Gaul. This suggestion was made by Tom O'Loughlin, who we'll come to in a moment. It strikes me as perhaps trying too hard to explain something that isn't really very sensible. So here we are, Tom O'Loughlin. Tom O'Loughlin is the Professor of Historical Theology at the University of Nottingham. And in a series of articles and eventually a monograph, he's argued that Arculf was a construct. He's taken the problematic name to the sort of logical conclusion, and that Adomnan based his account entirely on pre-existing written accounts, partly scripture, but also patristic writers, especially Jerome. And he eventually produced this monograph that you see on the left there, Adomnan and the Holy Places. And he does demonstrate that a very large part of the text is taken from Jerome or from the Bible or from other writers, and that other aspects of it can't possibly be the product of a 7th century eyewitness because things are described that are gone by the 7th century. His argument was that Adomnan's main purpose was exegetical, that he's using the geography of the Holy Land to explain to people certain essential truths about the Christian religion and the way to come close to Godhead. In other words, it's sort of allegorical or analogical. It's not a literal account of a journey. And he makes a good case that much of it must fall into that category. As I say, a lot of it comes from Jerome, some of it can't possibly be a 7th century eyewitness account. But it doesn't all fit into that model. And although he tends to avoid dealing with the problematic pieces, he was taken to task by Robert Hoyland and Sarah Wadler in 2014. I'm friends with all three of these people, by the way, so I don't have they're all smart, nice guy people. So I'm not attacking Tom O'Loughlin. He just carries his argument a little bit too far, which is what most of us do. Most scholarship is 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So Hoyland is an Arabist and Sarah Wadler a Celticist. They both now work in New York. And in 2014, they published an article arguing that there was material in De Locis Sanctis that described events and objects that belonged to the second half of the 7th century and could not have reached Adomnan other than by direct report. So, for example, there is a description of the earliest mosque on Temple Mount. It's probably the Mosque of Omar, which was probably built not very long before Adomnan wrote the book. There's also the section dealing with Muawiya, which is actually a very long section. It's a whole chapter, and I'm going to now be throwing a lot of text in front of you, even though I've cut down the original. But to make my point, I need to show you a reasonable amount of writing. So Hoyland and Wadler go through the text and pick out all the things that O'Loughlin either played down or didn't mention that show that there really was some sort of recent mid to late 7th century witness contributing to Adomnan's compilation. So De Locis Sanctis, Book 1, Section 9, Chapter 9, talks about how a cloth that had been laid over the face of Jesus in the tomb was taken by a pious Christian Jew and looked after and kept in his family. But then he says, but after the time of the 5th generation, when with the passage of many years, believing heirs of this line began to fail, the sacred shroud came into the hands of some Jewish unbelievers. They too, indeed, however, were unworthy of such an office, though unworthy of such an office, cherished it honorably and by divine generosity became enriched to a high degree with goods of various kinds. But when the true story of the Lord's shroud became known among people, the believing Jews began to contend boldly with the infidel Jews about the sacred cloth, seeking with all their might to get it into their hands. The rivalry aroused divided the people of Jerusalem into two factions, faithful believers, that is, against the infidel unbelievers. Upon this, the king of the Saracens, Muawiya by name, that's our Muawiya, when invoked by both sides in judgment between them, said to the infidel Jews who stubbornly held onto the Lord's shroud in the presence of the Christian Jews, "Give into my hand the sacred cloth that you have." So that's Muawiya speaking. They obeyed the command of the monarch and took it forth from its reliquary and laid it in his lap. The king took it with great reverence and bade a pyre be prepared in the court before all the people. When it was burned with great intensity, he got up and went right up to the pyre and said in a loud voice to the dissident parties, "Now let Christ, the Saviour of the world, who suffered for the human race, who had this shroud, which I now hold in my arms, placed on his head in the sepulchre, judge by the flame of fire between you, who contend for this cloth, that we may know on which of these two contending bands he will deign to bestow such a gift." And so saying, he cast the Lord's sacred shroud into the flames, but the fire was completely unable to touch it. Whole and unimpaired, it arose from the fire and began to flutter on high like a bird with outstretched wings, gazing down from above on the factions of the people. Thus at variance with one another, two armies set as it were in battle. For a space of some minutes, it fluttered about in the empty air, then gradually coming down, it swerved by God's guidance towards the Christian party, who meantime kept beseeching God the judge, and it settled in their midst. Lifting their hands to heaven, they gave thanks to God with great rejoicing, and falling on their knees, they received with great honor this venerable gift sent down to them from heaven. So this is a kind of judgment of Solomon story. Two groups have been competing over keeping a secondary relic, and Muawiya is asked to judge between them, and uses the fire and his knowledge of convection currents, presumably, to get God to show who he favors. So how should we interpret this story? Adomnan appears to be describing two groups of Jews competing for possession of a Christian relic, the cloth that covered Jesus' face in the tomb. Now, one question is, should we be translating Judaeus as Judean rather than Jew, i.e. inhabitant of the province in which Jerusalem lay? We nowadays think of Jew as being in contradistinction to Christian, but it does just derive from the word meaning an inhabitant of Judea. So might it just mean Judean Christians? Alternatively, Adomnan may be influenced by Paul's account of his meeting with Peter at Jerusalem in Galatians 2, where a distinction is made between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians. Paul, after 14 years of mission, has returned to Jerusalem to talk to Peter and James, the brother of Jesus, to clarify with them whether he's correct in allowing Gentiles to convert to Christianity without following all the practices laid down in Jewish law, Levitical practices with regard to diet, circumcision, and so on. And he has a discussion in which he manages to persuade Peter and James to allow two dispensations. So there will be Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians. That a different dispensation applies to people outside the original community, but the original community is allowed to remain more conservative, we should say. So that may be what's informing Adomnan. And people who know more about religion than me or about theology might want to comment on that. So then, how credible is Muawiya's role as the judge in a Christian in a Christian dispute? Well, as Hoyland and Wadler say, obviously the words where he calls Christ the Saviour of the world are not particularly credible. But of course, Muslims, particularly the early Islamic period, are very keen on the idea that Jesus was born of a virgin and was the Messiah. The Quran is absolutely full of references to Jesus as the Messiah, and the phrase supported by the Holy Spirit is only used for Jesus of all the different prophets and figures in the Quran. So that there should be great respect for Jesus is not a problem. And we also have evidence that he did actually adjudicate at at a synod in 659 at a debate between two Christian groups. We have an 8th or 9th century manuscript of a chronicle, which is known as the Maronite Chronicle, and it has this account of June 659. In the same month, the bishops of the Jacobites, Theodore and Sabucht, came to Damascus and held an inquiry into the faith with the Maronites in the presence of Muawiya. When the Jacobites were defeated, Muawiya ordered them to pay 20,000 denarii and commanded them to be silent. Thus there arose the custom that the Jacobite bishops should pay that sum of gold every year to Muawiya, so that he could not withdraw his protection and let them be persecuted by members of the church. Now, this may be based on some contemporary chronicle reference, but it isn't contemporary as it stands. There's no reason why an 8th or 9th century manuscript shouldn't contain a 7th century entry, but the fact that the Chalcedonians are called Maronites shows that this is not 7th century. That terminology had not yet taken over. In this period, they were called Melkites, which means imperials, followers of the king, because their form of Christianity was the form of Christianity followed by the Byzantine emperor, the Roman emperor. And they were the imperial church, and the Jacobites, who take their name from the 6th century Bishop Jacob of Saruga, are the Miaphysites, the largely Syriac-speaking church that had separated in the 6th century from the Melkite church, the imperial church, over questions on the nature of Christ. Both churches believed that Christ was effectively half God and half man, but they disagreed about how that actually worked on a practical level. And I'm not going to risk getting that wrong now. I think I know how it works, but I have to keep checking. But it's a Christological debate, but it also becomes a debate where, generally speaking, the Melkites, who become Maronites later on, are more likely to be part of the Greek-speaking community, and the Jacobites more likely to be Syriac-speaking. One of the things that's quite interesting about Muawiya's decision here, if it's true, is that he found for the side which you might not have expected him to find for, because his wife and most of his army were Jacobites. One of the things that made the Syrian province that Muawiya was ruling at this time, because note this is 659, this is before he's caliph, when he's simply the emir of Syria, is that unlike the other two major provinces that have been conquered in the first decades of the Islamic expansion out of Arabia, Iraq and Egypt, there was no large Hijazi garrison. In Iraq and Egypt, major military colonies were founded at Kufa and Fustad. Fustad is where modern Cairo stands, where Arab soldiers from the Hejaz, the area around Mecca and Medina, where Islam had originated, were garrisoned. In Syria, there was no such garrison. There were a small number of Hejazis, but generally speaking, the emir of Syria relied on local Arab tribes who were almost all Christian at this point, and they don't tend to convert to Islam until the 8th century. And the biggest of these was the Banu Kalb, the sons of Kalb. That means dog, rather bizarrely, sons of the dog. And Muawiya married two princesses from this tribe in succession. One of them, the first one, sadly died on an expedition to Cyprus. But the second one he married, Maisun, the daughter of Badal, for his son Yazid, who became his heir and followed him into the caliphate. And as I say, these were Jacobites. And the Melkites, the people called Maronites in this chronicle entry, were people who were generally suspected of being in league with the Roman Empire. It was the same church that the Roman emperors followed. So it's quite curious that he goes against what you might see as being his interests. But what this does show is that there's nothing surprising about Muawiya being involved in Christian politics. So why was this story important to Adomnan? Because Lachlan is absolutely right, as others have been who have emphasized the same line, that Adomnan's principal purpose in writing De Locis Sanctus was exegetical. It isn't useful as a basic guide, most of the material in there is clearly lessons about Christianity. And so we have to assume that this rather long chapter, which I only gave you about half of, I could have cut it down a bit, about Muawiya and his court case, must have some meaning for Adomnan's immediate audience. This story about Muawiya is one of the few current affairs anecdotes in the text. I think there's a reference to an imperial advent in Constantinople as well. But otherwise, almost everything else is a description of the physical environment, even the up-to-date things like the mosque on Temple Mount. It's all about physical remains, places where people were buried, visiting places where things happened in the past, and so on. So why should this story be relevant to Adomnan's intended audience? So this is where I'm getting onto shaky ground, and I'm going to make probably what might be a slightly crazy suggestion. I'm wondering whether Adomnan wanted to present Muawiya as a kind of type of Oswiu, a way for him to talk about the Easter controversy and the Synod of Whitby without making it explicit, without offending people, if you like. If you think about our world now, where people are afraid of calling a spade, for fear of offending people. So 5 years after Muawiya adjudicated between the Melkite and Jacobite bishops, another ruler adjudicated between bitterly opposed factions within the Christian church. In 664, at Whitby, a synod was held to debate the appropriate method for calculating the date of Easter in Northumbria, which at that time was ruled by father and son kings Oswiu and Arculf. A party led by Bishop Colman of Lindisfarne, who trained on Iona, advocated retaining the 84-year Easter cycle that was probably devised by Sulpicius Severus in Gaul in about 400. A party led by the Gaulish bishop Agilbert, who'd been expelled from Wessex and invited to Northumbria by King Alfred, advocated adopting a 19-year cycle that had been in use in Italy since the mid-6th century. King Oswiu, who himself had probably been educated on Iona, certainly in an Irish-speaking world, surprised everyone by judging in favor of the 19-year cycle, judging against himself, as Muawiya had done. So although the community on Iona did not abandon the 84-year Easter cycle until about a decade after Adomnan's death, Bede tells us that the abbot himself did recognize the 19-year cycle as the appropriate method for calculating the date of Easter. This has always seemed slightly problematic, and some scholars have suggested that this meant that Adomnan would have had to go into exile and couldn't have gone back to Iona. I've sometimes wondered when talking to students about this, that whether it simply means that Adomnan didn't regard the Northumbrians as heretical for doing it themselves, and that when he was visiting Northumbria, he went along, when in Rome, do as the Romans do, but would have been quite happy to use the old system when back home. We only have Bede's word for this. But Thomas Clancy and others have pointed to other bits of evidence in Adomnan's own writings that he had a more subtle approach. As an abbot, rather than a bishop, he had no authority over such issues. He couldn't actually change the calculation of Easter in his community. That's something the bishop in each diocese has to choose. But his being out of step with his own community has led to much speculation, as I said. Now, Stephen of Ripon, in his Life of Wilfrid, also gives an account of the Synod of Whitby, which we have a long account of that. It's from Bede, which is the one we tend to follow. Stephen has Wilfrid, his hero, who at the time of Whitby was working as Agilbert's translator. He was a monk, but wasn't yet an abbot or a person of significance. He was working as the translator for Agilbert, who only spoke Gallo-Romance, and Stephen has Wilfrid accuse those who used the older method of heresy, which is something no other writer does. This is quite important, that the Easter controversy debate was schismatic. That's to say, it caused a rift in a lack of Catholicity. People like Bede were very keen that everyone do everything the same way, that we're all one church. But it wasn't about the nature of theology, the nature of Christ's body, what happened. It wasn't eschatological in any way. It didn't have any effect on what people fundamentally believed about religion. And although there are suggestions in papal letters to the Irish that the arrogance of maintaining an isolated system when everywhere else has changed could lead to heresy, possibly Pelagianism. And I've just recently read Trent Foley's book on race in Bede's Historia Ecclesiastica, where he points to the fact that although Bede never uses the word Donatist, which is the name of a North African heresy, he takes a lot of language and phrases used by St. Augustine when confronting Donatists to describe the British Church, which also followed the 1804-year cycle. And Augustine's main anxiety about the Donatists was that they thought that their small church in Numidia, which is basically a quarter of Algeria, was somehow right when every other church in the world was wrong. But Wilfrid is said to accuse these people of heresy, and this accusation may well have created a problem for those like Adomnan curating the history of the church, particularly the Church of Iona. If Stephen were right, then Columba and Patrick and many other saints would be in hell, not heaven. I'm not sure anyone really ever seriously believed this, but I've sometimes wondered whether something like this might have been a reason why Iona delayed in accepting this judgment. And indeed, they do seem to convert eventually the year after Wilfrid dies. So they might just have been waiting for him to bugger off before doing the sensible thing. They just didn't want to give him the satisfaction. So in Adomnan's story of Jewish or Judean believers looking after the shroud of Jesus faithfully for 5 generations, it's only subsequently that the shroud falls into the hands of an unworthy heir. Now, this is too short a tally of generations to accurately trace the Jewiship, the guardianship of the relic from the resurrection to Muawiya, which was over 600 years. And although Adomnan doesn't quite say that it's the 5th generation that is being tried, or the 6th generation that's being tried, that's the kind of implication. And something I noticed was that that at the time of the Synod of Whitby, Iona was ruled by the 6th coab since Saint Columba, Comini Fin, the 6th abbot after Columba. And I wonder whether Adomnan had this in mind when he was curating this story. But what he was saying is you can have a generation of people doing something that's absolutely fine for a long time, but only at a certain point does it become not fine, and it doesn't reflect badly on the earlier generations. So in Adomnan's account of Muawiya's judgment, he's very clear that for 5 generations, the original holders of the cloth that covered Christ's face were true believers. They only lost their right to the relic after their belief strayed and that of another group held true. Canon law holds that one can only be convicted of heresy if one fails to accept correction. In other words, simply doing or saying something wrong doesn't damn you. It's if someone better informed, ideally your ecclesiastical superior, reminds you or points out to you that you've erred, and you then refuse to err, that you become a heretic. Failure to accept the judgment of the Synod is what condemned the Columbans at Whitby when Colman and others left. But their predecessors were not, Parce Wilfrid, guilty of heresy. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing now.
Well, thank you very much, Alex. That was as fascinating as I suspected it would be. What an amazing tale. It just shows, you know, the extraordinary breadth of connections, you know, in the early medieval times, which is easy to underestimate, I think, and the whole and the sophistication of thought of those times as well. I think it's absolutely fascinating. I had no idea that Adomnan had actually knew anything about what was going on in the Middle East. So I just think that's amazing. So thank you hugely. I don't know, I will invite questions at this point, and we don't seem to have any at the moment. But some positive comments. Bravo, excellent and erudite as always, is one remark. I have no questions of my own, I'm afraid.
If I could just sort of follow up on something you said about him not knowing things about the Middle East, one thing we should perhaps remember is that for much of the time that Adomnan was abbot of Iona, and certainly at the time that he was writing De Locis Sanctis, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was also the primate of the island of Britain, so possibly one of Adomnan's line managers, depending on how you think about these things, was Theodore of Tarsus, who was actually a refugee from Islamic conquest in Syria, who might have seen or met Muawiya at some point, or certainly would have had acquaintances in common with him. And I'm pretty certain that Adomnan would have corresponded with Theodore, even though there's no hard evidence for it, and possibly even met him as well. So this 7th century world is much more interconnected than you imagine. And I recently heard that Helen Gittos gave a talk in Cambridge, where she argued that some of the people buried in 7th century burials in southeast England, like the ruler at Sutton Hoo, who have an awful lot of Syrian material in the cloak that the Sutton Hoo king was buried in, doesn't survive, but the pollen that was stuck to it does, and that's from Syria. And she suggested that these people might actually have fought as mercenaries in the Byzantine army against the Persians in the 620s. So these worlds are connected, even though we tend not to think that they are.
Now, I know this is, I didn't know that about the pollen. That's amazing. Yeah, yes, it's hard for us, I think, to imagine just how connected everything was, really. It seems so incredible, with the difficulties of travel that there must have been and so on. So yeah, absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, it is extraordinary that people could travel so easily, but maybe we're just soft. I was thinking about this recently about, now we're not supposed to be flying and going all the way to continent on a holiday on train all the time, but I think, well, that's actually what we did when I was young. If you went to, so cheap fares only came in the 1990s, cheap airfares, and you did travel across Europe by train, and all those Agatha Christie people do, don't they? We're just very soft. We just think that travel has to be easy, unbelievably easy. But I think it's always been necessary. Bede had pepper, which he left in his will, and that only grows in southern India.
Yes, well, I think we are in. Well, I speak for myself only, really, but yeah, incredibly soft. Yeah, I mean the difficulties and hardships that people must have endured in order to get to places that were important to them and so on. It is incredible.
I see there's a question from Jen Wallace in the chat. She's
right, okay.
Any thoughts on why Adomnan would have used events from that part of the world and not something more local as a vehicle for his message? Well, I think there's two parts to that answer. That part of the world, perhaps because it is the Holy Land, and therefore you can always get people's interest in that part of the world. It seems for medieval Christians and Muslims and Jews, that was the center of the world. Why he didn't use something more local? I think, do you remember the beginning of episode 4 of Star Wars, the first Star Wars film? It starts, long ago in a galaxy far, far away. It's much easier to give essential messages if they're not too local. Some people have suggested this is why there's no sort of pedigree for King Arthur and why Arthur becomes the great hero of Welsh legend rather than someone from a surviving Welsh kingdom, and why we can't fit Arthur neatly into family trees. But if you want a universal hero or a universal story, it can't be one which immediately divides people by their local alliances. If I was trying to get people in Argyll in the, I don't know, the 15th, 16th, 17th century to listen to some sort of parable, it would probably be a mistake to call the characters Campbell and MacDonald. You tell that you setting it somewhere else, but perhaps with recognizable events, but where no one knew which character was their side and which was the other side, where you just had two feuding parties, you could be made ridiculous in their feuding and so on. So I think that's the reason that, and stories often do happen far away. In the Welsh heroic poetry of the Dark Ages is all set in southern Scotland and northern England. The great epic of Greece happens in Asia Minor, not in Greece, Trojan War, or it happens while Odysseus is sailing away. Beowulf, great Old English epic, set entirely in Denmark and Sweden. I think it's useful to set these things somewhere where people don't feel too personally and where it might be divisive in the modern community, as it were.
Mm. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. Yes, absolutely.
Bruce has a question, I think.
Yes.
7th and 8th century artifacts from this period as well. You mean from the East, Bruce?
That's right. Yeah, from the East. We had monimus coins being found from the East in the 10th century. But anything...
I mean, there's very few coins from anywhere in Scotland in this period. Just English Northumbrian ones from the bit of Scotland that was Northumbrian, but very few others before the Viking Age, which does lead to a massive increase in circulation of currency. There are some artifacts. I mean, I'm not sure quite where things stand on this now, but the crystal from the Galloway hoard, although buried probably around about 900, is probably from further east or south from the Mediterranean, and maybe from the Eastern Mediterranean, and is probably older. One of the things that I think probably was in Scotland but doesn't survive is I think there was probably silver or other metal plate from the East, because a lot of the Eastern images that you see, or the Eastern-like images that you see on some of the Pictish art, things like the little flying angels that look like they're based on Zoroastrian Ahura Mazda images, and griffins, and the idea of that you see on the Standard sarcophagus of a mounted rider killing a lion with a sword from horseback. These all look like 6th and 7th century Sasanian art from Persia. And we know that those sorts of images turned up on metalwork that was used by people like the Avars in Central Europe and other people in the kind of Ukraine, Central European area. And it's quite likely that this sort of material was sent around as gifts, like the Coptic bowl from Sutton Hoo, which is from Egypt and so on, but probably has got melted down and reused in some other way. But we might find something like that. I'm holding out for finding some piece of Sasanian or Avar silver in a Scottish excavation at some point. I think the visual imagery that looks Eastern on some Pictish sculpture, some Pictish carving, must mean that they had something to say. They had visual models in front of them. I think it's most likely plate. I suppose it could be cloth, but it looks so much like some of the material you find on silver plate that I think that's probably what it was. But I don't think there's a huge amount, but there may be little bits and pieces. The people going through the excavation materials from Iona will best tell us that. Adrian Maldonado or Ewan Campbell, perhaps.
Thanks.
That's a great thought.
Ian, do you have any clue as to where Addo was physically located when he was writing his various works and at what point in his life? I think we should assume that he was, during this period, he was mostly in Iona. He was abbot from 679 onwards, but as abbot of Iona, he would have travelled around other houses belonging to the Columban family. And we know he went to Northumbria probably twice, certainly once in Aldfrith's reign. I think he almost certainly did his serious writing in Iona. That's presumably where his study and his library was. And one of the very useful things Tom O'Loughlin has done is to try and work out what the library at Iona was like by going through both the Vita Columbae and De Locis Sanctis and trying to work out all the written works that Adomnan either quotes or comes very close to quoting in such a way that suggests he's paraphrasing them. And he has a very useful little article called The Library of Iona, where he's tried to work that out. So I would think that he did most of his work there and then would go out for a month or two at a time to Columban houses in Ireland or Scotland and occasionally a bit further afield. I imagine he would have attended major synods. We know that he was at the Synod of Burr in 697, but I imagine he would have attended others. Iona is frequently described as being between Britain and Ireland. And it's interesting that Adomnan in the Vita Columbae describes Oswiu as Oswald as Emperor of Britain, and I think it's Donald MacAither as holding the Empire of Ireland. So he clearly thought of Ireland and Britain as two distinct things, but discrete in themselves, and that Iona was somehow between them and connected to both. So he may well have attended synods that Theodore of Tarsus and people held as well for the Church of Britain. But we can't know this for certain. But I'm sure he did almost all his writing in Iona, I would have thought.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't know about missionary work. I mean, missionary work in Glen Lyon is retrospectively presumed because there are churches dedicated to him. But that's a slightly dodgy argument, because there's this older view that churches dedicated to a saint allow you to trace the saint's footsteps, but churches are never dedicated to anyone until after they've died and become a saint. So it's much more likely that the churches in Glen Lyon were founded by people who thought Adomnan was a great saint, i.e. after his death. They were almost certainly people associated with the Columban familia, I would have thought, but it's unlikely he was missionizing himself in that area. And we don't know anything, I don't think, about between his birth in Donegal and his becoming abbot of Iona. I think often people assume that he entered Iona as a novice or as a young man, but we don't even know that. The story he tells of Columba's training, which is obviously the way that he imagined an abbot of Iona was trained, is that he was trained by, I think, 3 different people in Ireland, in different places in Ireland, before becoming abbot of Iona. And so it may well be that Adomnan himself trained at various places. A number of other churchmen that we know about from this period in Ireland and Britain did this. They would start off in their local church, then be sent on to somewhere slightly higher, and then perhaps go on pilgrimage to a particularly renowned master who might be quite a long way away. Many English people went to Ireland and so on. Agilbert, the bishop who was at the Synod of Whitby, the Frankish bishop, the Gaulish bishop there, he had gone to Ireland to be educated and had been made a bishop there, and then sent to England to serve in the English church as part of the Irish mission, even though he was a Gaul. We don't really know anything about Adomnan's earlier career, but he could have travelled around quite a lot, certainly within these islands.
Mm. So we have some interesting comments from Gilbert. Next.
Yeah, so Gilbert says, I think we can treat De Locis Sanctis and Vita Columba as a kind of diptych. One shows the holiness of Jerusalem, one shows the holiness of Iona. I think you might be right about the Whitby message. Oh, thank you. There's another story in VC which also has a Whitby Easter message. The first 2 narratives in the whole work about Fintan Munu representing the 84-year cycle and Tom McNoy's representing the 19-year cycle. Yeah, it's possibly Sasanian. I think it's actually later, isn't it? More Central Asian, but it could be Sasanian, the pot in the Galloway hoard. But yeah, deposited date for how? Yeah, exactly. We can't know how long it had made it. Cool. And then Doug is presenting something from Angela Morris. Was there a difference with your historical approach to researching the Middle East versus your wheelhouse of Dark Age Scotland? I'm not sure. I mean, the major difference is I do know the primary sources for Scotland much, much better than I know the primary sources for the Middle East. But many of the sources are very different. I mean, I became very interested in Muawiya and gradually fed back into this project, partly because the sources about him are so conflicting and strange. He has this, according to the first life of the Prophet Muhammad, which is written just after the Abbasid Revolution, so about 100 years after Muawiya's time, Muawiya's family were the main leaders of resistance to the Prophet when he in Mecca, and they fought against him, literally physically fought against him. And Muawiya himself, as a young man, fought in battle against the Prophet. But then when the Prophet conquered Mecca, Muawiya's father was forced to submit, and Muawiya, being one of only 18 members of his tribe who could write, became one of the scribes for the Quran, according to this story. But he wasn't very good at it. He kept falling asleep, and he always wanted to stop for food. And a lot of the things say that he liked eating a lot. And in fact, we even have a short poem by his wife Maisun, which complains about him being too fat because he eats too much. So there seems to be this whole tradition in which is always gently mocking him and presenting him as someone who is who's sort of divided, a bit of a doubting Thomas perhaps, or a bit like Peter during the period between the crucifixion and the resurrection, someone who's sort of ultimately a force for good, but could have gone either way at lots of points and so on. He's a very peculiar character, and his extremely close relationship with Christianity obviously bothered later Muslim writers, but it's probably not that unusual for the period. We know, for example, that Umar, the second caliph rather, Umar, the second caliph, who was the one who captured Jerusalem. Jerusalem was defended by the patriarch Sophronius. And we have versions of this story that are almost identical in both Islamic and Christian sources. Sophronius said that he wouldn't surrender except to the caliph. So messengers are sent to Medina, and Omar rides on his camel, in his camel skin robes or camel hair robes, to Jerusalem, and Sophronius opens the door to him, and he says, "Oh, you're in terrible state, you're all covered in sand, and you've got these awful old robes." And he says, "Let me take those off you and give you nice new clothes." And Omar says, "Well, okay, I'll wear these now, but can you get someone to wash my camel hair clothes, because I want to have them when I leave. That's what I want to wear normally." And then he's taken to the Garden of Gethsemane, the tomb of the Virgin, and he prays in both those places. And then he goes to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and he prays outside that with Sophronius. He says, "I won't go in, because if I pray inside, people might want to turn it into a mosque, and that wouldn't be a good idea." But this story, which is told by, as I say, by both Islamic and Christian sources, makes it very clear that there was a very ambivalent attitude towards what we would call Christianity by people we would call Muslims in this period. But yeah, I'm just getting to grips with these primary sources. The real difficulty is knowing how to unfold all this later stuff. A lot of the stuff in Ibn Ishaq's Life of the Prophet may be informed by the Abbasid revolution. They may paint Muawiya's family badly retrospectively, in the same way that the Carolingians present the Merovingians as particularly poor kings, even though for them we have contemporary sources and know they weren't. So Sue has a question here. I think early Christian ascetics founded monastic groups in the desert of Syria, Palestine, Egypt. But why would the early church in Ireland and Scotland not have connections with it? Yeah, fair enough. That's right. One thing we tend to forget is that these areas remained majority Christian for centuries. Egypt probably only became majority Islamic around about the time of the Crusades. Syria, perhaps the same. So, certainly in Adomnan's time, which is within living, Adomnan was 10 when the prophet died. His life overlaps with the life of the prophet. So Islam, hardly anyone believed in Islam in Adomnan's lifetime. Not even all the Arabs, let alone all the people they conquered. So yeah, I think you're quite right. In this period, and for several hundred years to go, the Middle East was fully part of the Christian world. Bearing in mind, of course, that Nubia, that's modern-day Sudan, and Aksum in Eritrea and northern Ethiopia were also Christian. It's probable case that the majority of Christians in Adomnan's time were not living in Europe. They were living in Africa and Asia. Christianity is not a European religion.
That kind of segues nicely into Alastair's question about how Adomnan would have viewed the Islamic world.
Well, that's really interesting. As you might have noticed, he simply calls Marius king of the Saracens, and he doesn't at any point in De Locis Sanctis mention Islam. He doesn't. So if you read that not knowing anything, you might think this. Well, you would obviously think he was a Christian king because he appeals to Christ and he judges between two Christian groups. So one of the interesting questions is what people did think at this time about the Muslims, and certainly someone as far away as Adomnan. When Muawiya's son and heir Yazd had a sort of best friend when he was a little boy, who was the son of Sergeant Ibn Mansur, who was the administrator of Damascus under Muawiya, and who had also administered Damascus under the Romans before the Islamic conquest. And Sergeant's son is called Johanna, or John, and he's known now as John of Damascus. Later in life, he became an ecclesiastic, and he wrote a text which is called Against the Heresy of the Ishmaelites. And this is written in the 8th century, so about the time that Bede is writing, after Adomnan's dead. And the purpose of his text is to demonstrate that the Muslims aren't Christians, that they're heretics. The fact he had to write that might mean that many people before he wrote it didn't share that opinion. But we're getting into very dodgy ground here, and it's exactly what was going on, what these people thought they were doing, what other people thought they were doing, is unclear. I must admit, one of the first thoughts I had when I was reading the story, this not recently, but years ago, the story about the Jewish Christians in the De Locis Sanctis, I wondered for a moment whether that might be a way of describing Muslims, since they're circumcised and follow Levitical practice with regard to diet and so on. I did wonder whether that's what they look like. They look like Jewish Christians. And certainly there were also Jews in the Ummah, in the community of the Prophet in Medina. So maybe that would have been what they would have looked like. I think he probably wouldn't have had a clear idea, but equally, I'm not sure anyone would have. I think Islam per se really comes into formation in the course of the 8th century. I think in this period, exactly what they are, it's very hard to say, but they might have been regarded simply as a Christian sect. I mean, they're Unitarians. They're like Christians, but they don't believe Jesus is God. But that's not the way it ends up in the long run. And exactly where we were at and how well informed people like Adomnan would have been is unclear. I suspect that Bede in his Historia Ecclesiastica seems to have a clearer idea, but by that time, the Muslims had invaded Europe. They'd become a kind of existential threat to Catholic Christianity. And so that might have raised alarm bells that hadn't yet been raised in the late 7th century.
I think
in a way, that's my main interest in this period of what Paleo-Islam is what did people think they were doing? I think that, and the more I read, the more everything you thought you knew disappears in front of you.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating, isn't it? That is essential sort of fluidity of the time. That yes, nowadays
Yeah.
everything is so black and white, but obviously back then it was all very well, kind of up for grabs, really. Yeah.
I think so. I mean, I'm reading a book at the moment very slowly because it's very heavy going. It's by a guy called Gabriel Said Reynolds. And it's called The Quran and the Bible. And what it actually is it's a translation of the Quran, but with annotations showing where it's citing biblical or patristic texts or saints' lives and so on. And a lot of the things that seemed kind of weird the first time I read the Quran years ago about its misunderstanding of the Bible and of Christianity, it turns out they look odd from the perspective of someone brought up in a kind of Western Anglican Catholic mixed marriage family. But if you look at them in the context of what Christians in the Middle East believed in Ethiopia and in Syria and so on in the 6th century, a lot of these things are being lifted directly out of Christian texts. They're not misunderstandings. They're just a different version of Christianity than people like us are used to encountering. And there are quite a few direct citations. So however the Quran came into being, it came into being in a context where people were familiar with Christian scripture, but also with Jewish scripture. There are also citations from rabbinical literature in there as well. It's mostly Christian.
I think that's really fascinating. And if only various fundamentalists of all sorts realized just, what a melange all this stuff is to start with, and then becomes sort of so codified and black and white later on. It's just, very interesting. Well, we seem to have run out of questions, Alex. So I would love to just thank you so much for a fascinating evening. It's just been great, and we're greatly indebted to your scholarship, which is amazing.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm sorry you couldn't actually see you, Alistair.
Well, I'm not. It's not a pretty. It's not a pretty picture, so you haven't missed anything.
Okay, well, thank you. And thanks everyone else for your questions and so on.
Many thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Lots of lovely positive comments coming in. Yeah, really, really fascinating. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks.